the Trail of Tears stands as a pivotal and haunting chapter in American history, a brutal testament to the darker aspects of human nature. It was a forced relocation that would claim thousands of lives and forever scar the psyche of a nation. In the early 19th century, the southeastern United States was a vast and diverse region, home to numerous Native American tribes, each with their own distinct culture, language, and traditions. The Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations had lived in this region for centuries, developing complex societies, governments, and economies that were deeply intertwined with the land and its resources. As European American settlers began to arrive in increasing numbers, however, the delicate balance of power in the region started to shift. The state of Georgia, in particular, was at the forefront of this transformation. Founded in 1732 as a British colony, Georgia had initially been established as a haven for English debtors and a buffer against Spanish Florida. Over time, however, the colony had grown and prospered, attracting settlers from across the eastern seaboard. By the early 19th century, Georgians were eager to expand their territory, acquire new lands, and establish themselves as a major force in the region. One of the key figures driving this expansionist agenda was George M. Troup, a prominent Georgia politician who would later become governor of the state. Troup was a staunch advocate for Indian removal, believing that the Native American tribes standing in the way of white settlement were obstacles to progress and civilization. He and other like-minded individuals began to push for the forced relocation of the Cherokee and other Native American nations, arguing that this was necessary to make way for the advancing tide of European American settlers. As tensions between the state of Georgia and the Cherokee Nation escalated, the federal government became increasingly embroiled in the dispute. In 1802, the state of Georgia had signed a compact with the U.S. government, agreeing to relinquish its claims to Native American lands in exchange for federal support in removing the tribes. This agreement, however, was repeatedly ignored or violated by state officials who continued to encroach upon Cherokee territory and assert their authority over the tribe. In 1827, the Georgia state legislature passed a series of laws extending state jurisdiction over the Cherokee Nation, effectively annexing the tribe's lands and subjecting its citizens to state authority. The Cherokee, however, refused to recognize these laws, arguing that they were sovereign people with their own government, laws, and institutions. This bold assertion of independence was led by a remarkable individual named John Ross, a mixed-blood Cherokee who would become one of the most important figures in the tribe's struggle against removal. Ross, who had been educated in European American schools and had adopted many of the customs and practices of white society, was nonetheless deeply committed to his Cherokee heritage. He had risen to prominence within the tribe through his intelligence, eloquence, and tireless advocacy on behalf of his people. As the conflict with Georgia intensified, Ross emerged as a key leader, rallying his fellow Cherokee and arguing their case before state and federal authorities. In 1828, Ross and a delegation of Cherokee leaders traveled to Washington, D.C. to petition Congress and meet with President John Quincy Adams. Their mission was to protest the state of Georgia's actions, assert the tribe's sovereignty, and seek federal protection from the encroaching tide of white settlement. The Cherokee delegation was rebuffed, however, as Adams and his administration proved unwilling or unable to intervene on their behalf. As the Cherokee delegation returned from Washington, D.C., they were met with increasing hostility and aggression from the state of Georgia. In 1829, gold was discovered in northern Georgia, which led to a surge of white settlers pouring into the region, further exacerbating tensions between the Cherokee and the state. The discovery of gold also brought new economic interests into play, as speculators and prospectors sought to capitalize on the newfound wealth. This influx of outsiders put additional pressure on the Cherokee, who found themselves facing not only the threat of removal, but also the erosion of their traditional way of life. In response to these developments, John Ross and the Cherokee National Council adopted a more assertive stance, seeking to protect their sovereignty and territorial integrity through diplomatic and legal means. In 1830, the Cherokee Nation filed a lawsuit against the state of Georgia, arguing that the state's extension of jurisdiction over their lands was unconstitutional. The case, known as Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, would eventually make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where it would become a landmark test of the relationship between the federal government and Native American tribes. Meanwhile, the election of Andrew Jackson as President of the United States in 1828 marked a significant turning point in the conflict over Indian removal. Jackson, a longtime advocate for westward expansion and Indian removal, had built his career on his military campaigns against Native American tribes in the Southeast. As president, he would prove instrumental in pushing forward the policy of Indian removal, which would ultimately lead to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes that would exchange their lands east of the Mississippi River for lands west of the river. As the Treaty Party gained momentum, they faced fierce opposition from John Ross and his supporters, who vehemently opposed removal and argued that the treaty was illegitimate. The divide within the Cherokee Nation deepened, with the two factions engaging in a bitter struggle for control of the tribe's future. Meanwhile, the federal government continued to pressure the Cherokee to relocate. In 1834, President Jackson appointed a new commissioner, Benjamin F. Curry, to negotiate with the Cherokee and persuade them to accept the terms of the Indian Removal Act. Curry's efforts were met with resistance from John Ross, who refused to negotiate with him. The impasse between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation continued, with neither side willing to compromise. In 1835, a group of Cherokee leaders, including John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and Stan Waddy, traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Jackson and his administration. They were determined to negotiate a treaty that would allow the Cherokee to remain in their ancestral lands, but Jackson was resolute in his determination to remove them. The meeting ended in failure, with the Cherokee leaders returning home empty-handed. Undeterred, the Treaty Party continued to push for removal, arguing that it was the only way to ensure the tribe's survival. In December 1835, they gathered at New Echota, the former capital of the Cherokee Nation, to sign a treaty that would cede all Cherokee lands in Georgia to the United States. The treaty, which became known as the Treaty of New Echota, was signed by a minority of Cherokee leaders, including John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, but it was rejected by the majority of the tribe. The signing of the Treaty of New Echota marked a turning point in the history of the Cherokee Nation. The treaty paved the way for the forced relocation of the Cherokee people, which would become one of the most infamous episodes in American history. As the news of the treaty spread, the Cherokee people began to prepare for the worst, knowing that they would soon be forced to leave their ancestral lands behind. In the spring of 1836, the United States Army, led by General John E. Wool, arrived in Cherokee territory to begin the process of removal. The Army's presence was met with resistance from many Cherokee, who refused to leave their homes and families behind. The scene was set for a tragic confrontation between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both parties. As the summer of 1836 wore on, the situation in Cherokee territory continued to deteriorate. The Army's presence had created an atmosphere of fear and tension, with many Cherokee living in constant dread of being forcibly removed from their lands. The tribal leadership was divided, with some leaders advocating for resistance and others urging cooperation with the federal government. In the midst of this chaos, John Ross and his supporters continued to fight against removal, using every available means to resist the federal government's efforts to force them from their lands. They petitioned the federal government, seeking to have the Treaty of New Echota overturned, and they appealed to public opinion, hoping to garner support for their cause. But despite their efforts, the tide of history seemed to be against them, and the Cherokee Nation was poised on the brink of a disaster from which it would never recover. General John E. Wool, who had been tasked with overseeing the removal of the Cherokee people, began to implement a series of measures designed to coerce the tribe into leaving their lands voluntarily. He established a network of stockades and forts throughout the region where Cherokee people could surrender themselves and await transportation to Indian territory. However, many Cherokee refused to give up and instead retreated to the mountains and forests where they formed small bands of resistance. One such band was led by a young Cherokee warrior named Solly, who had lost his family and home to the encroaching white settlers. Solly's group, which numbered around 50 men, women, and children, lived off the land, hunting and foraging for food as they evaded the army's patrols. They also launched sporadic attacks on the soldiers and settlers, hoping to disrupt the removal process and buy time for their people. Meanwhile, John Ross and his supporters continued to seek a peaceful resolution to the crisis. In July 1836, Ross traveled to Washington, D.C., where he met with President Andrew Jackson and other government officials in a last-ditch effort to persuade them to overturn the Treaty of New Echota. However, Jackson was unmoved and instead reiterated his determination to remove the Cherokee people from their lands. As the summer drew to a close, the Army's presence in Cherokee territory became increasingly oppressive. General Wool's men began to round up Cherokee people and hold them in stockades, where they were forced to await transportation to Indian territory. The conditions in these stockades were harsh, with inadequate food, water, and shelter. Many Cherokee people fell ill, and some even died while being held captive. In October 1836, the first group of Cherokee people was forcibly removed from their lands and began a long journey to Indian territory. This group, which numbered around 800 people, was led by a Cherokee leader named Junaluska, who had previously fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the Creek War. Junaluska's group traveled overland, following a route that took them through present-day Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. They faced numerous challenges along the way, including treacherous terrain, inclement weather, and disease. As the winter of 1836 to 1837 set in, the removal process accelerated, with thousands of Cherokee people being forcibly removed from their lands and sent west. The conditions on the trail were brutal, with many people suffering from exposure, hunger, and disease. The Cherokee people were forced to travel long distances on foot, often in bitter cold and rain, with inadequate clothing and shelter. Many died along the way, including women, children, and the elderly. One of the most notorious segments of the Trail of Tears was the crossing of the Tennessee River, which occurred in December 1836. A group of around 1,000 Cherokee people, led by a leader named Whitepath, was forced to cross the river in freezing conditions, using makeshift rafts and canoes. Many people fell into the water, where they succumbed to hypothermia or drowned. Others died on the riverbanks, where they had been left to await transportation. As the winter of 1836 to 1837 wore on, the removal process continued to exact a devastating toll on the Cherokee people. In January 1837, a group of around 2,000 Cherokee, led by a leader named Richard Taylor, was forced to depart from Ross's Landing, a small settlement on the Tennessee River. This group, which included many women and children, faced particularly harsh conditions, with temperatures plummeting to below freezing and snow covering the ground. The trail was treacherous, with steep hills, icy streams, and muddy roads making every step a struggle. Meanwhile, John Ross, who had been unable to persuade President Andrew Jackson to overturn the Treaty of New Echota, continued to advocate for his people's rights. In February 1837, he wrote to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Carrie Allen Harris, detailing the horrific conditions faced by the Cherokee people on the trail and pleading for relief. However, his efforts were largely in vain, as the removal process continued unabated. In March 1837, a group of around 1,500 Cherokee, led by a leader named John Brown, arrived at Fort Gibson, a military outpost in present-day Oklahoma. This marked the end of their grueling journey, but it was far from the end of their suffering. The conditions at Fort Gibson were dire, with inadequate food, water, and shelter leading to widespread illness and death. As the spring of 1837 arrived, the removal process finally began to wind down. In April 1837, the last group of Cherokee, led by a leader named Stan Waddy, departed from the stockades in Tennessee and began their journey to Indian territory. This group, which numbered around 1,000 people, faced many of the same challenges as those who had gone before them, but they were at least spared the worst of the winter weather. In May 1837, the Cherokee people began to arrive in Indian territory, where they were forced to establish new homes and communities. The conditions were harsh, with limited resources and infrastructure making it difficult for the Cherokee to survive. Many people died in the first year after arrival, due to disease, malnutrition, and exposure. In June 1837, John Ross arrived in Indian territory, where he was greeted by his people, who had suffered so much during the removal process. He worked tirelessly to help them rebuild their lives, establishing a new government and advocating for their rights. However, the trauma of the Trail of Tears would stay with the Cherokee people for generations, a painful reminder of the brutal treatment they had endured at the hands of the United States government. In the years that followed, the Cherokee people struggled to recover from the devastating effects of the removal. In 1838, the Cherokee Nation established a new capital called Tahlequah, which would serve as the center of their government and culture. The nation also began to rebuild its economy, with many Cherokee people turning to farming and trade to survive. In 1839, the Cherokee Nation adopted a new constitution which established a democratic form of government and guaranteed certain rights to its citizens. This marked an important step towards self-governance and recovery for the Cherokee people who had suffered so much during the removal process. As the years passed, the Cherokee Nation continued to grow and develop, with many Cherokee people becoming prominent leaders in their communities. In 1840, the nation established a national newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, which would serve as a voice for the Cherokee people and help to promote their culture and interests. In 1841, the Cherokee Nation also established a national school system, which would provide education to Cherokee children and help to preserve their language and culture. This marked an important step towards preserving the Cherokee heritage, which had been threatened by the removal process. The legacy of the Trail of Tears continued to shape the lives of the Cherokee people, however, with many families still feeling the effects of the trauma and loss they had endured. In 1842, a group of Cherokee leaders, including John Ross, traveled to Washington, D.C., where they met with President John Tyler and demanded justice for their people. The meeting was unsuccessful, but it marked an important step towards recognition of the injustices that had been perpetrated against the Cherokee Nation. In the years that followed, the nation continued to advocate for its rights, seeking compensation for the losses it had suffered during the removal process. In 1845, the Cherokee Nation signed a new treaty with the United States government, which provided for some compensation and recognition of the nation's sovereignty. However, the treaty was far from perfect, and many Cherokee people felt that it did not go far enough in addressing their grievances. The nation had suffered greatly during the removal process, but it had also shown remarkable resilience and determination. As the Cherokee people looked to the future, they knew that they would always carry the legacy of the Trail of Tears with them, a reminder of the struggles they had faced and the strength they had shown in the face of adversity. The Trail of Tears stands as a haunting reminder of the darkest chapters in American history, a brutal testament to the devastating consequences of greed, prejudice, and oppression. The forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans, resulting in the loss of countless lives, cultures, and communities, has left an indelible mark on the collective conscience of our nation. The Trail of Tears may be a chapter in our shared history, but its impact continues to reverberate through the lives of Native American communities today, serving as a poignant reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and reconciliation. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.